I thought I should begin because I seem to be giving lots of papers with the same title, the Digital Studies Manifesto. You've got it written down in front of you as the third Cultures Humanities Manifesto. I changed the name to the Digital Studies Manifesto on the suggestion of Vincent Puig of the Institut de Recherche et d'Innovation, who's not here. And since I'm giving so many papers at the moment with the same titles, I thought I should differentiate them by subtitle. So what you've got today is I'm working on a little book, which will hopefully be finished sometime this summer. And this is really the introductory bit. It's not a very analytically profound thing. It's fairly discursive, I have to say. The real meat, I hope I get so far as making it meatier, will come in the Digital Studies seminar in Paris in about a fortnight's time, when I'll also be talking a bit more about a project I'm working on at the moment for a kind of invention. Since I'm talking today about the reinvention of the humanities through digital studies, this is the kind of platform that I'm working on developing, but I'm not going to have any time to talk about that today, but by all means follow it up in due course. So we might begin with a quotation from Bernard's État de Choc. General organology constitutes a paradigm for the humanities in the era of the digital humanities, positing, theorizing, and experimenting across disciplines. General organology constitutes a paradigm for the humanities in the era of the digital humanities, positing, theorizing, and experimenting across disciplines with questions of therapeutic knowledge, capable of identifying both the toxicity and curative potential of pharmaca. The digital studies network, of which this conference constitutes one node, alongside others in Paris, Tokyo, Berkeley, Durham, Leuphana, and Quito, among others, is an open access economy of contribution that gathers together research in the developing field of technology studies. It is, in this sense, also something of a precursor to the coming semantic web, or Web 3.0, which names a collaborative movement seeking to institute a common language through which to bring together the numerous codes underpinning the internet. As a name for technology studies, digital studies is a nascent academic discipline, or rather the attempt to create a cohesive dialogue from work that transects a whole host of disciplines: philosophy, both continental and analytic, classics, literary criticism, critical social theory and social psychology, cultural anthropology, media studies, socio- and co-evolutionary biology, ecology, post-Darwinian neuroscience, to name only a few. Some of these fields are long established, while others are only more recently taking hold in the interstices of the university, from where digital studies emerges as an instance of the much anticipated third culture between the arts and the sciences. Over and above a new disciplinary cartography or interdisciplinary lingua franca, digital studies is perhaps more than anything, as Bernard would say, a paradigm for the reinvention of the humanities. Corresponding to the new episteme of the digital, a fold in our knowledge that comes after the age of the book, in which our social institutions, very much including the university and even our concept of the human, remain rooted. This paradigm of digital studies is also that of what Bernard calls general organology, meaning the study of the relationship between our anatomical architecture and the artificial organs or prostheses through which we supplement it. As the opening quotation indicates, these prostheses can be both beneficial and harmful to our functioning, toxic or curative, and usually simultaneously, depending on the ways in which they close down or open up the possibilities of human experience. Sacrificial blades have enabled us to communicate with the gods, but their heady power can easily spill over into murder, as plenty of tragedy will tell us. From Roger Bacon to Kepler, Vermeer, and Henri Cartier-Bresson, lenses have helped us to see, but their intensity can also quite literally blind us. And over the course of human history, their artificial selection is thought to have induced a genetic weakening of eyesight. A smartphone eliminates space and time, but it also renders us vulnerable, unused to silence, and forgetful of numbers, appointments, and directions, hence overly dependent on this new object of addiction. The ease and risk of intoxication is why the use of technical objects has always been regulated or organized, by rules enshrined in culture, whose rhythms and rituals set out the conditions for their adoption. Digital studies is thus also cultural criticism, the study of the production of humans and their social institutions through techniques, and of the kinds of humans that different techniques cultivate. At least in the first instance, the digital studies is occasioned by the digital revolution, the dawn of the information age. Following the agricultural and industrial revolutions of the Neolithic and Enlightenment periods, this constitutes the third so-called great cultural shift of human history, or even of a broadly construed Anthropocene, which some suggest began with the Quaternary extinction event, when for the first time humans' artificial selection of the Pleistocene megafauna may have served as a tipping point in environmental collapse. But deriving from digitus or finger, the organ, the distal limb through which we manipulate tools, digital studies moreover pertains to the study of technical objects in general and their mutually constitutive relationship with the humans who use them. It pertains to the tools and technical environments that we inherit through culture and whose adoption opens up horizons of thought and possibility through which we carve ourselves out a future. The great cultural revolutions are also, in this respect, organological revolutions, which is to say, transformations of human civilization around evolutions in our artificial organs and their cultural organization, which, by reorganizing the human body and sensory cortex, bring about profound and traumatic changes in the life of the mind. Stone Age tools for building and food storage paved the way for the domestication of nature and the ensuing development of trade. The liberations, but also the increased dependence on tools opened up by the division of labour, proved anxiogenic for Stone Age settlers, whose developing capacity for economic thinking made them vulnerable to the pursuit of self-interest, which they accordingly sought to curb through rituals of reciprocity and gift exchange. Those of you may be familiar with the work of Marshall Sahlins, where that comes from. In the 19th century, similarly, techniques of mass production combined with capitalism to afford cheap printed reading material and the prospect of privatized, unsurveillable experience to the increasingly visible middle and working classes. The results to which readers of Madame Bovary and Le Rouge et le Noir can testify was an awakening of imagination that went hand in hand with widespread anxieties over public access to the democratic dreams of upheaval that novels would bring. After the initial euphoria of the internet and globalization, with their promise of unlimited information and the power to overturn distance, we are now dealing with a range of resurgent traumas, including the collapse of privacy in the print media, plus fears over the effect of easy access pornography on attitudes towards sexual violence. If the World Wide Web has in many respects increased our ability to participate, our newfound access to data has contributed to a dilution of confidence in our existing institutions. The press and markets are exposed to the speed of news and panic, while search engines enable us to call into question the expertise of the medical and scientific establishments through the flattening effect of what Bruno Latour termed straight-talking double-click. We gain access to any number of opinions, informed or otherwise, just by clicking through hyperlinks. The presentation of truth is experienced as no more factual than the most spurious conjectures. All knowledge is reduced to equivalence, as Latour puts it. Despite the popular taxonomy of the Third Industrial Revolution, there have been other organological phase shifts of no lesser importance than the births of agriculture and industry, and which entailed similar periods of instability and disadjustment, bursts of creativity and spiritual malaise. The uptake of alphabetized writing over the course of 5th century Athens, for example, directly fed into the birth of both modern Platonic philosophy and also into the collapse of democracy, played out via an intergenerational conflict that lends itself so readily to comparison with the media revolution of the last half-century. Typified by May '68, Occupy and the Snowden fallout, Recent reactions against the heavy-handed control of information find a distant echo in the youth rebellions of Alcibiades and Critias, the students of Socrates who grew wary of the restrictions of oral culture, exemplified by the vague and unwritten rules of direct democracy, which produced litigiousness, filibustering, a constant changing of minds on the part of speakers in the Greek demos, and ultimately it gave rise to voter apathy and growing absenteeism from participation. If Socrates corrupted the young, it is, as Eric Havelock has shown, because he devised new methods of education appropriate for a literate culture, in place of rigid customs committed to memory through the rote learning of oral poetry. He taught dialectical conversation as a prosaic instrument for breaking the spell of the poetic tradition, substituting in its place a conceptual vocabulary and syntax that challenged the hierarchical family structures underpinning the social conventions of orality. Although his trial represents a backlash against the trauma unleashed by literacy, although Socrates' trial ultimately represents a backlash against the trauma unleashed by literacy, the Athenian demos was ultimately saved by the codification of laws in writing, the reorganization of society around the very technology that had threatened to destroy it. Inscribed in stone for public viewing, the letter of the law became binding because it seemed objective, impersonal, infinitely repeatable, not arbitrary. Both of these arguments, incidentally, are coming from excellent books by Eric Havelock and Robin Waterfield. The advent of this new writing, which Plato described as a pharmacon, both pure poison and cure, would also bring about more long-standing changes in Western culture. Even the concept of selfhood, Havelock suggests, owes its invention to the permanence and abstraction of formalized written grammar, which allowed the speaker to exist apart from their language. Plato's universal absolute ideas were an extension of that. Just as ancient Athens had to reorganize itself around a shift in its technical culture, so too must we recreate educational and political institutions that are adequate to the technological transformations of the present epoch. The advent of digital technology has exacerbated a loss of faith in politics, which has been reduced to the populism of images, sound bites, and thraldom to the superficialities of social networking. And the social organs through which we could address this loss have similarly been undone, as schools and universities struggle to keep pace with the implications for learning of nascent debates on cognitive saturation, screen addiction, and the effect of real-time technologies on the formation of attention and memory, all of which are bringing home to the extent to which humans are, and always have been, constituted through techniques. Questions over the nature of digital selfhood are further raised by the ease with which we have ceded our most intimate details to proprietary platforms like Facebook and Google, while issues of the ownership of harvested content, alongside those of a fundamental reorganization or casualization of the labor market, beset the online press and the virtual university courses, or MOOCs, that have emerged to threaten the viability of their non-virtual traditional counterparts. What we are seeing, in other words, is a recasting of the foundational categories of social organization in light of the digital revolution, including not just the sphere of politics, the media and education, but also the labor market, commerce, individual rights and freedoms, even desire, sex and the family, from consumerism and Grindr to reproductive biotechnologies. Encompassing all of these is a transformation of the concept of the human, a category that, however internally inconsistent, has grown isomorphically to accommodate the changes of the present era, precisely because it is a product of that era. Back in 1689, John Locke augured the modern doctrine of the self-owning individual with the claim that every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. A quotation there from the two treatises on government. The premise underwrote the Lockean justification of private property, which was seen to stem from the mixing of one's labour with the soil. We might, with hindsight tilted in the direction of the slave trade, wonder whether it wasn't the other way around, whether private property didn't give rise to the fantasy of self-ownership once we'd internalized that idea. Either way, ideas have moved on without necessarily being wholly abandoned. Translating theory into practice, the information capture debates of the digital age have done more to unground the proprietary subject than Freud and Deleuze ever did, and multiple self-contradictory new versions of the human are now holding sway. The discourse of properties lives on to some extent in medicalized folk biology, according to which we're genetically hardwired, hapless victims of inherited fallibility and innate sex drives. Elsewhere, the desire for privacy is merely a nostalgia that runs up against our evolved status as instinctive sharers and networkers. And if we are assumed to tolerate the violation of privacy, withstand the high rate of technological and social change, it's because we are technologically enhanced superhumans built onto adaptable plastic and liquid animals, programmable and pourable to fit any mold, though supposedly hard enough to withstand future shock. This is the new ideological meta-narrative of adaptation, which evaluates humans through their ability to withstand change. It makes the world of work a test of character and fitness, recasts universities as preservers and enhancers of our natural flexibility to bow and not break, and has been invoked to legitimate inertia on the matter of climate change too. We'll adapt to the future, so why make changes now? As if adaptation were a passively bestowed byproduct of time, arriving without effort on our part. For a rising tide of critics, including Stiegler, this animal adaptability is precisely what is now being exploited by practices that leave our intermittent capacity for humanity or self-invention through techniques ever harder to come by. We have been reduced, in the words of Beatriz Preciado, to pharmacopornographic subjects, rendered helpless by the mining of our libidinal energy and sale of narcotic pleasure, which serve as the blueprint for digital capitalism. At stake in the prevailing accounts of who and what we are is a categorization pertaining to the relationship between technical culture and the ideas of the human to which it gives rise, and there's much at stake in the struggle to interpret this and other categories that organize culture. It goes without saying that different visions of the human either legitimate or contest a range of ethical and political practices, including our treatment in the workplace, our vulnerability to forces like advertising, and the kinds of therapies that get prescribed for our ills. The way in which our understanding of concept gets appropriated and reinforced, for example by Google, whose page ranking system ensures the consolidation of dominant modes of thought, is a key question of the humanities reconceived as digital studies. It's also the subject of ongoing research into categorization, for example in Paris with Stiegler and Vincent Puig's Institut de Recherche et d'Innovation, but also with Bruno Latour's AIM project, the inquiry into modes of existence, being all about the creation of new social categories. But it's not enough simply to interpret the new categories of digital culture. We must also create them. And on that level, digital studies is not simply a descriptive field of knowledge. At the risk of sounding melodramatic, it's a battlefield for the future, if there is to be one, in which academics become tasked with the duty of forging new arms, of moving from a critical discourse on technology to the development of techniques to reawaken what, extending an idea of Derrida, one might call the intermittently glimpsed promise of the human. The human conceived not as an existing entity, but as a horizon of desire and possibility, a dream that is projected when we employ our tools to wrest away from the technologies of consumerism, an agency that is anything but given. The concept of urgency is monstrously abused by a great many academics who want to describe pretty much anything trite and insignificant as urgent, from filling a gap in a dead playwright's voluminous correspondence to publishing another book of minutiae to be read by next to no one. Caveats aside, The preservation of this promise of the human genuinely is urgent. The British neuroscientist Susan Greenfield has recently written on the effects of a mind change that is potentially as dramatic, she argues, as climate change, referring in this instance to the unprecedented effect, and I quote Susan Greenfield here, the unprecedented effect of the cyber world of the 21st century on the formation of our highly malleable brains. In an argument that recalls our ecological concerns over the loss of biodiversity, Greenfield discusses her alarm at the loss of what we might call neurodiversity, related to the increasingly homogeneous forms of screen-based stimulation that activate the reward systems of the brain. If consciousness, she argues, is an emergent property of our complex neural networks, then consciousness increases in proportion to the complexity or variety of the brain's stimuli. And if this variety decreases, Greenfield warns, then we effectively become less conscious, suffering a neurological dulling of the senses. This kind of pacification and loss of attentiveness is precisely what we cannot afford when we have, according to politicians' predictions that may or may not be plucked from thin air, some 15 years left to prevent the worst-case scenario of climate change. Stiegler has long advanced the line that attempts to combat climate change will amount to nothing unless we first address the underlying causes of our demotivation through an ecology of spirit, or therapies for our insufficient care of the self, where selfhood must be understood as inseparable from its milieu. Others, most notably the Gaia theorist James Lovelock, have argued that it's already too late for us to act, that we may as well just enjoy what time we have left before the environment collapses completely. For those of you who know Lovelock's work, he argues that between 2030 and 2150, 13 out of every 14 people on the planet will die through environmental collapse, with the global population levelling off at about 500 million in 150 years' time. So Lovelock argues that it's already too late for us to act, that we may as well just enjoy what time we have left before the environment gives way. But that kind of response risks being symptomatic of the carefree enjoyment that is at the root of our current plight. And it moreover leaves unanswered the crucial question of too late for what exactly? For though it may be too late to save nature, we might at least create a future for culture, or the collective memory through which we become human in the first place. Unless we manage the decreasingly probable feat of creating a new ecology of spirit or breeding new kinds of non-inhuman animals with a hitherto unseen capacity for collective salvation, current estimates suggest that the digital age will be the last of the great organological revolutions before we go the way of the Neanderthals. It's usually said that the Neanderthals went extinct because they reached some kind of cognitive cranial limit, where they were no longer able to invent new tools that would have helped them adjust to the coming age of the Holocene. But this, it now seems, is simply not true. The Neanderthals, we're now beginning to realize, succumbed to what we might, borrowing from Stiegler, call epiphylogenetic collapse, a breakdown in the process of cultural evolution through which the acquired experience of our ancestors is passed on to the future, through which the savoir-faire, the cultural knowledge sedimented in our tools, the tools that mark our cultural point of departure, this is what constitutes the basis of cultural evolution, or what Bernard calls epiphylogenesis, and it's a collapse of epiphylogenesis that we now know spelled the end of the Neanderthals. Anticipating the future that James Lovelock has diagnosed for over-specialized and insufficiently generalist Homo sapiens sapiens, our last hominin ancestors are now thought to have died out when increasingly fragmented, isolated populations proved unable to sustain the division of specialized labor or tool use characteristic of Neanderthal social structures. The philosopher of biology, Kim Sterny, describes a dramatic a dramatic erosion of the accumulation, preservation, and intergenerational transmission of cognitive capital, where the imperative of survival meant that young Neanderthals were called upon to use tools for which they were not adequately trained, unable to access the accumulated cultural knowledge locked up in their inherited technical objects. They were unable to modify them in the face of new environmental challenges, unable to modify their environments through the tools which they couldn't properly use, and they thus succumbed to extinction. When the floods come and the power fails, this will likely also be our future. To quote from Lovelock, "Imagine the survivors of a failed civilization. Imagine them trying to cope with a cholera epidemic using knowledge gathered from a tattered book on alternative medicine. The discovery that bacteria and viruses caused infectious diseases is relatively recent. Imagine the consequences if such knowledge was lost on account of it having been stored on some inaccessible magnetic or optical medium that we could no longer access when the power grids go down." This fate would spell a magnification of the consumer lock-in that has seen us reduced to hyper-specialist and broadly passive consumers of the technologies we have at our disposal. And as such, it might be mitigated by a concerted effort to expand the horizons opened up by our contemporary tool use. This again will be the task of digital studies, construed as both a paradigm of the humanities, the study of culture and its relation through tools to redemption, and as a prescriptive call for the reinvention of tool-led humanizing agency. Final paragraph here. The humanities are in many respects the study not just of culture or cultures of tool use and the humans to which they give rise, but also of the disadjustments, the time lags between technical evolution and the expansion of concepts of the human to accommodate and withstand new traumas. It's this time lag that means we perennially arrive too late, like Hegel's Owl of Minerva. And it's also why the humanities are permanently in some kind of crisis, constantly called upon to defend ourselves in terms that can't help but feel defensive. That makes us easy victims too. One further detail marks the constellar relation between the organological revolutions of the alphabet and the internet, ancient Greece and the age of excess, and that is the scapegoating of the humanities. In his elaboration of a professionalized educational program that, according to Havelock, marks the introduction of the university system into the West, Plato's Socrates counsels that the guardians of the Republic should not be taught poetry. Poets should furthermore be driven beyond the walls of the ideal city, lest the seductive corruptions of fiction and imitation threaten the harmony, the division of labour that separates out the guardians from the philosopher kings. It was not until Havelock, for whom the exile of the poets marks the jettisoning of the old order of oral education. It was not until Havelock that Plato was read at his word. In periods when the value of culture was perhaps less constantly subject to interrogation, or when irony and parody were among the foremost preoccupations of criticism, the notion of banning poets was rarely taken at face value. But it chimes a plausible peal at our own present conjuncture of technological disadjustment, when the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry has been replaced by a more general suspicion of less vocational utilitarian subject areas, supposedly maladapted to a world of science and a Darwinian economy. Now as then, it's been all too easy to identify older forms of cultural production with an outdated vision of humanity, to imagine the anthropotechnics required for the breeding of future humans as being wholly distinct, tout autre, from the poetic rituals of classical tragedy and the humanism of the book. And it's been all too easy to infer from that, however nostalgically, that the humanities tout court retain only vestigial archival interest. To overturn this cynicism, it needs to be shown that the human is, and always has been, the projection of a certain kind of writing or artifactuality, the rewriting of the biological body and brain through techniques, And the challenge of the humanities reconceived as digital studies must be to show that we do not simply adapt to and acquiesce in the environments we have created. The writing of humanity and its future can be commandeered, however belatedly. Even as the ice caps melt and the floodwaters arise, the discourse of artificial selection, not to mention the fact of artificial selection, might still swim against the tides of genetic drift. Okay, thank you.